All right. Grace and peace to everybody. So this video is going to be on Daniel 77s again. And I think I'm going to do one more after this, and it's going to be focused on some issues with Seventh-day Adventism. But this one, like I've said in the past, I have not had too many interactions with the futurist position, but recently what I've heard from it, I'm gonna address some issue what I see as some issues with their position on it. Um, so, with that being said, one thing we need to keep in mind whenever we're getting into the weeds, when we're looking at grammar and stuff, any word without a context has no meaning to it, right? So when you go and you look at a lexicon, and the words in the lexicons are the simplest forms, they're just singular, usually masculine. Um, they don't have any actual meaning to them. What you see in the lexicons is the sense or the definition of the word that you're looking up. That's why the semantic range of any word is usually varied in size, but there's always multiple within that range, that semantic range. That's because the word needs to be then put into its context and given the proper meaning. Not only the context of the immediate context and how it interacts with the other words in the sentence, but also the bigger context of the chapter and even the book itself need to be taken into consideration. So we need to keep that in mind whenever we're looking up words, and we don't just arbitrarily pick a definition of a word and assume that into the text. Adventism tends to do that. But let's go over Daniel 77. So in the first 20 verses, 22 verses, Daniel is praying for restoration, right? Because the Jeremiah 70 years are just about to end. And in the prayer, he's lumping the restoration of the land, the sanctuary, the people, the city. When I say land, I mean city as well, and the people. They're so intertwined that he's just kind of speaking them interchangeably as one. So when we get down to verse 24, Angel Gabriel gives his answer to Daniel's prayers. And what needs to always be kept in mind when we're going through verses 25 through 27, because 25 through 27 is an expansion of verse 24. And this happens in other books as well. I think off the top of my head, Revelation 12 does this. Daniel does this as well too in other chapters. But here, the angel Gabriel says, and like I said, keep this in mind when you read through the rest of the verse 24, 25, 26, 27. 70 weeks. So notice all of those 70 weeks or 77s are decreed about the Jewish people and the city, so Jerusalem. And these 6 things next that are listed are the 6 things that will be accomplished within those 70 weeks, not outside of, not paused and then accomplished later on down the road. Within those 70 weeks, all of these 6 things will be accomplished. And I know the futurists will say, well, there is a gap that is seen at the end, and so it still can be accomplished within, or they may even say, actually, I think what they say is that this happened within the 69 weeks. But see, that's the issue, is that it's not the 70 weeks. The 70 weeks are finished when all of these 6 things are accomplished. And I think everybody can agree that these 6 things refer to Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. So in other words, the completion, fulfillment of the old covenant is what this is speaking of. And we know historically that happened at Christ's first coming. So at Christ's first coming, he finished transgression. He put an end to sin. He atoned for iniquity. He brung in everlasting righteousness. He sealed both vision and prophet, and he anointed a most holy. And all of that was to happen within those 70 weeks. And they happened historically in the first century AD. So, keeping that in mind, in verse 24, we now then go through verses 25, 26, and 27, understanding that verse 24 says all that has to happen within the 70 weeks. And also, that is the main focus of the 70 weeks. So, in other words, that's the main focus of verses 25 through 27 as well, not an antichrist figure that uh, is never mentioned in scripture wants to ever create uh, or I should say in the book of Revelation, excuse me, is never mentioned of creating a covenant with somebody that ceases sacrifices in a literal temple. So verse, oh, let me go back to Daniel 9. I clicked the wrong button, excuse me. All right, verse 25 says, something needs to be noted real quick. I heard Standing for Truth say that the 7 sevens, the 62 sevens, and the 1 7 are to be broken up into 3 parts. And that comes from the Masoretes. They created this, let me get to it. It's called a disjunctive. Uh, where is it? Excuse me. It's called here we go. It's called a disjunctive accent or an atna, A-T-N-A-H. And the Masoretes, through their tradition, added this into the text in Daniel 9:25 because they saw the need to break these up. But if you look at older traditions like the Septuagint or Theodosian's translation of the Septuagint or Symmachus's translation or the Peshitta or even the Latin Vulgate, none of these, as far as I'm aware, have that atna or that disjunctive accent. So in other words, the 7 sevens and the 62 sevens don't need to be uh, seen as 2 separate time frames. They're seen as 69. Now, one might say, well, why even word it that way? What I would say is that through God's providence and through his power, this is one amongst other ways to conceal the words of this prophecy, because it's definitely not a normal way to talk about time, especially time of a prophecy. It's a very, very odd, uh, almost seemingly symbolic way, because it's using sabbatical and also jubilee years to um, distinguish this time. But let's go through verse 25. It says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks." Now, the ESV follows the Masoretic tradition and it says 7 weeks, then for 62 weeks. And I personally don't really care which one you pick. I think the breakup is not needed. I think it's a later tradition. I think the saying the 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So in other words, verse 25 is talking about 69 weeks. I think that is the better reading. But even if you want to go with the breakup of it, it's still not going to affect it overall, because all of these 70 weeks need to um, be completed by the cross, because that's when the cross fulfills all those 6 points mentioned in verse 24. But anyway, I go on. It says, uh, I'll just read it again. "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time." Now, this is obviously referring to, I would say, the coming of Christ at the end of the 69 weeks, but also it's referring to the complete rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, this, and I would include also the sanctuary and even, generally speaking, Judah. Because if you go back into the prayer of Daniel, what is his part of his prayer? The restoration of the people, the sanctuary, and also the city. So all those 3, in my opinion, are to be included here. This is kind of just saying that this is the complete restoration of Jerusalem and its people. And the troubled time, I would say the troubled time refers to opposition not only with from without, like with the Samaritans. I believe historically speaking, they opposed Israel going back to the land and doing all their stuff, but also spiritually within. There was a laziness, a slacking with the people of Israel to rebuild the sanctuary and in Jerusalem. And this is recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah and other books in Haggai. And also Daniel talks about, like in chapter 10, he talks about a very real spiritual battle that is happening with demonic and angelic forces. Now I'd say this is in the background of this as well too. Verse 26. Let's see. Okay. It says, and after the 62 weeks, and so some will point out the word after. Notice the word after. And in verse 24, they'll also point this out. I forgot to mention this. Um, let's see if I can remember what it was. Or maybe it's not in verse 24. Oh, okay, no, it's in verse 25 when it says, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of, or some translation will say until the coming of. They'll say that and word until or to the in this version, and also the word after in Daniel 26 where it says and after the 62 weeks. They say that these words imply that there needs to be a gap between the 69 and the 70th week, and that is assumed and imposed in this text, because if you keep that, like I said, that verse 24 in mind, all 77s or all 70 weeks need to be finished by the time those six stipulations are done, which again we all believe happened by Christ historically in the first century uh, on the cross. And also, I would add 66 to 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, and I will get to that here in a second. So, verse 26, I'll read again. And after the 62 weeks, so in other words, after the 69 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off. And I think it's pretty clear to anybody who believes that the cutting off right there refers to the death of Messiah. So the cutting off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince, now here's part of the dispute, right? The people of the prince, who is that? If you read, and I'm going to mention this again in verse 27, if you read Josephus's account about what happened in 66 to 70 AD, and specifically you read about John of Giscala, and there's other accounts in there, but if you read about John of Giscala, he was a Jew in that time who was a very wicked man, let's put it that way. And if you read about him, you'll see why I say that. I'll mention a couple of things. But him and his crew, his faction, and there was civil war happening with the Jews at that time. So I believe Eleazar and I believe as the Zealots were also another faction fighting with John of Giscala and his merry band of Jews, of non-wicked or of wicked Jews. And so they're fighting. And John of Giscala, as I remember correctly, he barricades himself in the sanctuary. Not only does he barricade himself in the sanctuary, but he allows his men to rape and murder women, and also to actively um, um, practice homosexuality in the sanctuary. And he also tore down the different elements in the sanctuary. So he was, needless to say, a very, very wicked man. And he also actually crowned himself the king of um, the Jews at that time. It just read it and you'll see why I believe that he fits and his crew and the zealots as well to fit um, what I'm going to mention here. And I would also say in chapter 11, at least starting at verse 36. But the people of the prince, I would say, is the Jewish people. And I would say the prince is Messiah, because I think from history, the Jews were the first to destroy the city and the sanctuary before the Romans even came, because the Romans, I believe, if I remember correctly, wanted to have a peace treaty first before they even finished destroying the city and the sanctuary. But the John and Giscala and the Zealots weren't having it. And so that's why I think that's first and foremost. So the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed. I would say that's referring to Titus and his army coming in 70 AD and finishing everything off. So there's kind of both of them there, in my personal opinion. But even if you want to say the people of the prince is Titus, that when it comes to prophecy and it comes to some of these texts that, like I've said before, we sit on the shoulders of giants, people who have done amazing, amazing scholarly work that I could never do in my lifetime, even if I wanted to or tried. And so for me to sit here and talk about this kind of stuff is because of their hard work. And so I'm not going to be insanely dogmatic, other than to say that this is referring to Christ and what he did at the cross and his accomplishments there. Beyond that, details like, is it the people of the prince, is it refer to Titus or the Jews? Either one. I prefer to say it's the Jews. I think that fits better and is more accurate historically. But either one is fine. I'm not going to be super insanely dogmatic about it. Verse 27, there's the huge dispute, which is why we saw two debates happen this weekend on who is the he. And from what I understand, and I don't know Hebrew, from what the authority or the people that I've read, the antecedent for he is not the people, the prince, because both the people and the prince um, are the subject and an object there with each other, whereas the he, its antecedent is found not in the people or the prince, but in Messiah or the anointed one. And if need be, I can post some material that goes more in depth, more scholarly than I could enunciate. Um, but grammatically speaking, the noun, it has to agree 100% with its antecedent. So in other words, it needs I believe the he is a uh, third singular masculine noun, and that needs to agree completely with its antecedent. And Messiah fits that, whereas Prince does not and people do not. So, like I said, I can post more scholarly material on my feed if need be. If you guys want to check that out. So I would say the he here is Messiah, and also why I say that even without the scholarly work, you go back to verse 24. What's the main focus, the main subject here? Even in verse 26, what's main subject is the anointed one. Verse 24 refers to what the Messiah will do and the accomplishing of ending the covenant. And we know if you hold to the New Testament, Messiah is the one who did that, accomplished all of those things. Messiah is also the one that's spoken of about making a covenant. I cannot find a single place in the New Testament that talks about an antichrist figure making a covenant with the Jews. I just don't see it. If it's there, I will stand corrected and I'll correct this and I'll say it openly. Um, but I don't see that in the New Testament. All the evidence from the New Testament points to Christ being the one who makes a strong covenant. And if you also take it, kind of almost seems that verse 26 and 27 recapitulate it, just saying the same thing in a little different way. Because notice in verse 26, after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off. That cutting off is where the covenant happened, right? The covenant in my blood. Verse 27, he shall make a strong covenant with many. Okay, there's the covenant in both verses right there. It seems to be talking about the same covenant, in my personal opinion. And and then it says, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And that continues what I'm saying is that ending of sacrifice and offering. The New Testament very clearly, I don't think anyone would dispute this, very clearly, what Christ did at the cross put an end to sacrifice and offering. Theologically, it ended at the cross. And then if you keep on reading in verse 27, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate. I would actually say this refers to uh, the people of the prince, the Jews, and I explained, gave some details why that is. And then it says, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolate. I would say that decreed end being poured out is Titus being poured out on the Jews, because the main focus is the Jews and the Jewish people. So historically, the sacrifices end at the destruction of the temple. Theologically, they end at the cross. And I believe there's a verse. Let me see if I can find it real quick if you guys don't mind. Um, there's a verse that makes that point in Hebrews, and I can't remember the wording, but it basically says that the old covenant has done an obsolete, and it's also fading away or disappearing. So that's almost seems like an allusion to verse 26, 27 here. Um, that's not finding it, darn. Let me see. Let me switch version maybe. Sometimes I remember words from the King James version as opposed to ESV version, which I usually use ESV actually. It's one that was bought for me by a friend, so I cherish that, and also just one that I've always had available. I would like to have. Actually, I have others. Like I have Young's Little Translation on me, but and I have KJV 1611. I have Geneva Bible. I'd really like to have a Bishop's Bible. That'd be pretty cool. I had it was super cool. It was on the internet though, but I found it was the Wycliffe translation. And man, that English that I think Wycliffe translated when he translated the Bible, I think that was Old English, I believe. And then the KJV is Late Middle English, or Middle English. I forget which one. But the English in that Old English, I couldn't even read it. It's very fascinating the changes that happen in language. But I'm not really finding the verse off the top of my head, but it is in Hebrews. I do know that. And it's between verse or chapter 6 and 9, I believe. If somebody's listening to me and can post it on there, that would be super awesome because I can't seem to find it. But anyways, the verse does make the same point that I'm just making, that theologically, the Old Testament ended at the cross. And then it also says in that same verse, it's fading away. That is the historical or the building itself and the Jews still practicing it was fading away and going to be done with at 70 AD. And so this walkthrough that I did hopefully makes it pretty clear. I don't see where any gap can be added. There seems to be a theological presupposition that is imposed onto this text. Because if we keep in mind, like I've said multiple times, verse 24 is the key right there. All of this ending of the old covenant is going to happen. It has to happen by the time the 70 weeks ends, and we know that happened at the cross. I did hear SFT go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 22. And there's a very similar verse. I'll read it for you guys. It says, in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Oh, that was verse 21, excuse me. Verse 22, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And they'll say, if that right there is an Antichrist figure, then why isn't the one in Daniel 9 an Antichrist figure? And that's a very legitimate question. What I would say, which is what I said at the beginning of this recording, is words without a context have no meaning. They just have a sense or a definition. That's usually why the semantic range of a word is decently big, usually, because they have various meanings within a context. So you have to put a word within a context. So the word Prince of Covenant even can refer to something else within a different covenant. And I think that's what's happening here, is that it is either referring, I'm not 100% on Daniel 11. I do know that about after verse 36 or about 36 that it does switch over to the Jews and John of Giscala. I kind of see and hear starting with Persia, it goes down from Persia, Greece, and then to Rome. But I'm having a hard time figuring out where the transition to Rome is. I know it's at least in verse 36, but it could be sooner. But there is some evidence that this could also be referring to Antiochus, and like in First Maccabees, it talks about him making a covenant with the Jews. That could be referring to this. Either way, it does not have to refer to the same prince of the covenant in chapter 9, especially when chapter 9 made it pretty clear the context and the focus of all that, which was Messiah and completing of the covenant. Whereas here in Daniel 11, the focus seems to be different than that. So that's what I would say if I was in a debate with SFT on this topic and I had that question. Um, and I'd also point out that um, what was the other thing he said? He said, I wish I knew how to kind of play his recording and then play it and then stop and I could just comment on it because I have a hard time remembering his arguments and reproducing those properly to you guys. So I apologize for that. So I'll probably, I think I said everything I need to say about this. My next recording, I'm going to talk about the SDA's position on Daniel 9 and Daniel 8 and how they link and why they link Daniel 9 and Daniel 8, the 2300 days and the 77s together, uh, and why that's wrong. And that also gets into the Hebrew as well. So again, there's no evidence, objectively speaking, in this text that warrants any type of gap between the 69th and the 70th week, even if you want to point to the words and after the 62 weeks. It's kind of like if we say after let's see, how would I say this? Oh, I'm going to be working for 1 hour, and then after that, I'm going to come see you. Usually that means, right when I'm done with that hour's worth of work, I'm coming to see you. Now, obviously, now this is God's prophecy, and so there's not going to be variations and discrepancies. But with us, there could be a chance that traffic takes longer or some other issue comes up and it delays us a little bit. But there's none of that mentioned here in the text. And so even with the limited human example that I gave, which is I work for 1 hour and after that, I'm going to come hang out with you. It's pretty clear that the after the 69 weeks is the 70th week. There is no anointed, there is no gap that's mentioned right there when it says after the 62 weeks. There's no gap there. It's saying the last week is where the anointed one will be cut off. And even verse 27 reiterates this and says, in the middle of that 70th week, uh, the strong covenant is made. And as I pointed out, the strong covenant, there's only one in the New Testament mentioned. There's not another one. And it says for half in the midst of the week, the covenant, and then also the ending of sacrifice and offering. And again, there's only one thing in the New Testament that talks about the ending of sacrifices, and it's Christ again. And so it's very artificial to say that there's this gap of 2,000 years or more in here when there's just no mention. So I think I've stressed my point pretty clearly. Um, so I thank you guys for watching, or I should say listening, not watching. I'm used to recording on my phone and posting the video. So I appreciate you guys listening. I see a couple of comments here. All right. Bible research tools. Awesome, man. Hey, I think I saw your name was Don or Dan. I appreciate you coming on and listening, man. I appreciate that. Hopefully I explain things. I'm not the best at explaining things and walking through things. Uh, oh, you say John of Giscala and his men also drank the sacred wine. Yeah, exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. Doesn't John of Giscala seem to fit that better than Titus and his men there? Uh, because all the things that John did in the sanctuary there very clearly were abominations. I mean, homosexuality and all that stuff happening, the raping of women and murdering them. And it was horrendous. Um, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that one sometime. What else do you say? And B, Shiva, heptads. Yeah, the heptads, the sevens. Yeah. I was reading. Yeah, I was reading the Jews for Judaism website, and they have it split up in 7 sevens and 62 sevens and 1 7. And it's interesting that the futurists go along with that, or at least Standing for Truth did. He fits the man of sin. I mean, I've never really thought about that, but I also do hold that I believe that Book Revelation, uh, the things that happened there didn't end in 70 AD, but I believe they um, span through, at least some of them span through all of Christian history, because I think there's this tension in the church age, and I think the Book of Revelation goes through those tensions pretty well. But I do see why the preterist says that they would be ended in 70 AD. I just think that overemphasizes that, and I don't think the text necessarily says when it says that these things are to happen soon that means that they will end soon as well. Maybe some of them. Um, but like I said again, I see that some things as future. I do believe there will be a future end time antichrist as well too. So, but anyways, that's another time. So I thank you guys again for listening. Grace and peace. Grace and peace. God bless.